Thank you, Professor Billings. Thank you to our sponsor, the Glazer Institute for Jewish Studies. When Professor Billings told me that I would be surrounded by surfboards tonight, I thought he was speaking metaphorically, just by being in Malibu. But no, this is pretty amazing. Coming to you live from the surfboard room. It's good to be here. Most of you are probably not engaged in translating the Hebrew Bible into English, right? So I'm not going to attempt to train you to do that in just an hour. Rather, let's see if we can challenge you to be an even more savvy and knowledgeable reader of other people's translations, such as the New International Version NIV or the ESV, English Standard Version. Does that sound like a worthy goal?
Yeah.
Okay. So for this purpose, I will use gender as the aspect of interest to kind of interrogate the text. And now, that may or may not be an abiding interest of your own. Regardless, you can probably use my investigation of gender as a model for any questions you wish to ask of the biblical text in terms of its plain sense. By plain sense, I mean when the Bible is read according to everyday, normal ways that we use to determine what someone's utterance means. There are other ways to read the text, such as allegorically or mystically, but that's not my concern tonight. Just the plain sense, ma'am. Hold the mail. To give you some hint of where I'm going with all this, let me share with you this favorite quotation of mine. Loose ends appear constantly, and that is part and parcel of the nature of translation. In other words, translating the Bible is messier, and the biblical text itself is fuzzier than you would probably like to think. That's just how it is. Now, in what aspect of the biblical text do I care about gender? Quite simply, in the various ways that the text makes reference to persons. That's when I find myself wondering, does the Bible want us to think of those persons as being manly or womanly or either or neither? To answer that kind of question, we can practically never look at just one word and say, oh, that's referring only to a man, not to a woman. Rather, we must make inferences from the context. There are at least two reasons for this: the nature of language in general, and the way the Bible in particular is composed. For example, if I say, wow, that's a big trunk, am I referring to this, or this, or this? And in fact, there are other possible meanings as well, but I won't go there. My point is, what I mean by that remark, wow, what a big trunk, depends on what I'm standing next to when I say it. That's the context. Linguists express the point like this: the precise semantic contribution of any word is a function of the utterance context in which it is embedded. As for the special nature of the biblical Hebrew text, its prose in particular employs a remarkably limited vocabulary. It uses the same restricted set of terms over and over again. The Bible treats its words much like a mosaic artist treats individual tiles when composing a mosaic picture. That artist, working with a limited color palette, may employ the same tiles to represent the sky and the flowers on a tree and a rutted roadway. That color correlation is presumably meaningful. Like a mosaic, as opposed to a high-resolution photograph, the biblical text is fashioned so that its meaning inheres less in precise individual words and more in the arrangement of the words, their juxtaposition and their groupings. So in order to know what's going on with a particular word, it really helps to stand back and look at the bigger picture. Let's consider some actual biblical examples. In so doing, I want to appeal to the curious part of yourself, the part that likes to solve puzzles. Think connect the dots, or jigsaw puzzle, or crossword puzzle, or Sudoku, or Rubik's Cube, okay? Our first case is found in the book of Exodus. Even if you don't have a clue about Hebrew, permit me to read aloud first the passages of interest out of respect for the original language that the translators are working from. Ve'ata hakreh lecha et Aharon achicha ve'et banav ito mitoch bnei Yisrael. Lechano li Aharon, Nadav va'Abihu, Elazar ve'itamar. You shall bring forward your brother Aaron with his sons from among the Israelites to serve me as priests. Aaron, Nadav and Abihu, Elazar, and Itamar. Now this is no one's particular translation. They all render this in the same way the term that's of interest to me here, which is the noun banim, highlighted in red. It's a grammatically masculine plural noun appearing here in construct with a possessive suffix, so it's pronounced. The word is pronounced banav. Tonight I'm not concerned with what the word means, except for its gender implications. That this noun does not necessarily exclude women from view can be seen from Leviticus 6:11, which uses banim in its open construct form as b'nei. Reads as follows: Kol zachar b'vnei Aharon yochalem. Every or any male among Aaron's banim may eat of it. Now, if banim by itself referenced only Aaron's manly descendants, that is, if it excluded his daughters and granddaughters and so forth, then there'd be no need to separately specify the males, right? You get the logic here? Okay, so if the experts indeed all agree with that kind of thinking and say that this reference made with banim is not gender specific. It being a plural term, furthermore, banim can't ever specify the gender of a party that it refers to, except to say that the group in question does not consist entirely of women. Hebrew has, like Spanish, for example, in having a masculine and feminine gender for its words, its nouns in particular. So if I wanted to say that group was entirely of women, I would use, the text would use a grammatically feminine form and uses a grammatically masculine form for everything else. Which prompts the following question, way back in Exodus 28:1. Why do all the English translations, including my own, render banim as sons? Why not a gender-neutral term, like descendants or children or offspring? Especially given that the book of Leviticus elsewhere tells us that Aaron had daughters as well as sons. Well, the fact that none of these four offspring is a woman is inferred mainly from that same verse in Leviticus that we just saw. All four must be men, otherwise they wouldn't be eligible for the priesthood. So this speaks about being able to eat certain kinds of offerings, the meat of certain kinds of offerings that were considered most sacred and brought to the sanctuary. Okay then, but wait, we still have this problem. The noun banim here in this verse doesn't specify sons as opposed to daughters. We've established it's a gender-inclusive term. Why don't the translators tell us that the text, what it says right here, instead of what it means based on a whole different passage in another book? Well, remember, we're going from one language to another. And the answer is really because of the way English works. It's not a matter of what's going on in the Hebrew Bible itself. Each language has its own way of marking gender. Translators have to respect the way that both languages operate. According to English idiom, it is expected that a speaker or narrator will mark, that is, specify the gender of a party in question in a couple of cases. One at first mention, or wherever gender is at issue. In our verse in the book of Genesis, gender is at issue. It's Aaron's sons as opposed to his daughters. which warrants then a gender-restricted rendering as sons based on the needs of English. Conversely, according to English idiom, we don't keep pointing out gender once it is already known or if it's not germane. That's not a matter of political correctness, by the way. It's just the way English has always worked. For example, if you've been following the recent news story about the thousands of people who had played in the National Football League and then sued for damages after sustaining head injuries, how did sports writers and sportscasters refer to them? They referred to them as former players or as athletes. Excuse me, these are gender-inclusive terms. Really? Gender-inclusive terms to refer to the manly men of the NFL? Come on, everybody knows that the folks who play in the NFL are men. It's a men's-only sports league, right? Well, that's exactly the point. If everyone knows their gender, then it goes without saying. And the same convention explains why all translators render the references to the gendered Israelite priesthood, wherever they may appear, in gender-neutral terms. It's not to suggest that women in ancient Israel could be priests. Rather, it's that if the translators kept writing male priest wherever a priest was mentioned, it would be overkill as far as English idiom is concerned. You with me? So let's go to the next case. This example will illustrate another one of the main points that I would like to convey tonight. Translating from one language to another involves making trade-offs. You give up something in order to gain something else. This second case comes from the center of Leviticus, in the section that begins, "The Eternal One spoke to Moses as follows. Speak to the whole Israelite community as follows. You shall be holy, for I, your God, the Eternal One, is holy." And after several verses, it says this, "Lo tisna et achicha bilvavecha." You shall not hate in your heart any one of your kin, according to NRSV. Here are several other renderings. You shall not hate your brother in your heart. You must not hate your fellow Israelite in your heart. Do not hate a fellow Israelite in your heart. These are published translations that either you have already encountered or are likely to encounter while in college. I've listed them in chronological order of publication, no other preference. Question: what accounts for the variety here? Are we talking about one's literal male sibling, as here in ESV? Or one's extended family, as kin here? Or the entire nation of the Israelites, like these two? And is this verse including women in its purview or not? The answer is, all three renderings are both accurate and inaccurate. Each translator is emphasizing one aspect of the Hebrew expression's meaning at the expense of other aspects. They have each handled the trade-offs in somewhat different ways. Let's explore the Hebrew noun at issue. It's pronounced ach. Like banim, it's a grammatically masculine personal noun, though this time it's in the singular. And elsewhere it is often paired with a grammatically feminine counterpart term, achot, which has led many observers to conclude, wrongly, that any party whom the word ach refers to must be manly. Ach, achot, that's feminine. Only for women? Well, this must be only for men. That's just not how Hebrew works. In the case of ach, in fact, the book of Jeremiah clearly used it like a gender-inclusive term. The prophet recounts an episode in which the king of Judah and Jerusalem's elite together covenanted to free their indentured servants, both male and female. The narrator explains that they were acting on the basis of a long ago directive from God, which is then quoted as follows. Tishalachu ish et achiv ha'ivri asher yimacher lecha. Each of you shall send off the Hebrew ach who was sold to you. Now Jeremiah had said that the Israelite elite were very reluctant to free their servants. So why would they have freed both male and female servants? Unless they were sure that the term ach applied to all of them. Linguistically speaking, we can explain their action by noticing that any noun, ach, for example, can be used in two distinct ways. One way is to point at the referent in particular in such a way as to distinguish that party from the other parties in the vicinity, as if to say, that's the one. This is exemplified by the very first instance of ach in the Bible. Vatosef laledet et achiv et Havel. After giving birth to Cain, Eve gave birth again to his ach, Abel. Now, both Cain and Abel are boys. They both share the same parents. So in this kind of specific pointing activity, ach seems equivalent to what in English we mean by using the word brother. Would you agree? So that's what comes from one way of using ach to point at a referent. The other way is to point to the referent in terms of membership in a class or category of some kind, thus making a statement that applies to all of its members, that is, to anyone who fits the description. That's what we had in the Jeremiah example. Which ach is this referring to? Any Hebrew ach who has been sold to you, right? That's why they would release all of the slaves or servants, indentured servants, males and females. The king and the elite of Jerusalem have taught us that whenever a grammatically masculine noun like ach is used to point to a category of persons, the gender of anyone in that category remains unspecified. In such situations, this so-called male noun functions like a gender-inclusive term. So maybe we're ready to return to our verse in Leviticus. And now we can ask, does ach here point to a category of persons, or does it point to a specific individual? Who does it apply to? Does it apply just to one particular ach that is being singled out in this verse from all the other achs in the room? No, it's any ach that's in the vicinity that you might possibly ever come to hate. Anyone who you might feel tempted to be enervated at. So it points to a category of persons, and it's effectively a gender-inclusive term in this case. Well, so shall we just render it into English with a gender-neutral word and call it a day? Not so fast. Remember in our first example how a reference to Aaron's banim was also gender-inclusive, and yet we decided that the word needed to be translated as sons rather than as children or offspring. And remember what I said earlier, that we need to look at the context in which a personal noun is used. Well, it happens that the latter part of our verse in Leviticus speaks again of this same party. Another reference to this same party, but does so using a different designator, a different noun, amit. This reads, Hocheach tochiach et amitecha. Amit is used in Leviticus to refer to persons with whom we have business dealings, or whom we might sue in court, or whom we might accidentally injure while interacting with them. It has a community feel to it. It's bigger in scope than one's family, more like one's associate or one's fellow or one's neighbor. So wait, what does the Hebrew text convey? By having first employed the term ach to refer to a potential enemy within my neighborhood, or in my case, within my own condo complex, someone who might be tempted to hate. There are a few. It means that, despite my inclination, I should practice picturing that person as a peer, neither above me as a social superior to resent, or beneath me as an inferior to disdain, but on a peer level, someone like me. As someone with whom I might actually share a close kinship. Meanwhile, there's nothing in this context that would exclude women from view. So let's go back to what I said before about English idiom. Do the translators have any warrant to translate in gendered terms like we had in our previous example, the case of Aaron's sons? Well, in this case, gender is not germane. So if we are communicating in normal English, our rendering ought to be gender neutral. Let's look again at our 4 translations. What's going on in the second one with the ESV that it uses the gender term brother? Well, the general editor of the ESV is among those scholars who believe that the word ach never loses its gender flavor entirely, no matter how it's used, even when it's used to point to a category of persons. He also believes that it's essential, for reasons of gender politics, I think he would admit, to keep gender in the foreground whenever there's any hint of it in the Hebrew text. I happen to disagree, as I've already argued. I would say that such an approach actually makes gender more of an issue than the Bible text itself does. But to the credit of the ESV, its distortion of normal English does convey a nuance that otherwise gets lost in translation. Namely, that the Hebrew term suggests the closest possible kind of kinship. Brotherhood. Closer than kin, closer than fellow. It also evokes the way that the word brother is sometimes used in English, as in band of brothers, or the brotherhood of man, or the way that African Americans may refer to one of their fellows, even when they don't know personally, as a brother. If I translated gender neutrally as, you shall not hate your sibling in your heart, it just wouldn't have the same impact, would it? Translations involve making trade-offs. So which of these translations is best? That depends on what you wish to accomplish. Bible scholar and translator Michael V. Fox, with whom I had the privilege to work, has put it well. Translation is a form of mapping. There are different maps for different purposes. Sometimes I want to see on Google Maps, see the traffic patterns. Sometimes I need to turn them off because they're distracting. I want to focus on something else. Sometimes I want a topographical map because I'm interested in climbing or riding my bike and I want to know where the hills are. Different maps for different purposes. Recognizing this allows for a pluralistic approach to translation. We're about ready for my third and final example. In this example, my main point is this. Use the same frame of reference as the ancient Israelites would have used. The question that I bring to the text is, who stood at Mount Sinai to receive God's revelation? That is, were women part of the scene or not? Chapter 19, verse 17 of Exodus. Vayotze Moshe et ha'am likrat Elohim min ha'machaneh vayityatzvu b'tachtit ha'har. Then Moses led the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mount. I chose NIV just because it was succinct and fit on the page. They're all pretty much the same here. So are women in view? What the answer turns on is the definite noun ha'am, which grammatically is a Hebrew collective term. Collectives regard the group in question that they point to as a single entity. Examples of collectives in English include the assembly, or the crew, or the gang. Like use a singular verb. The assembly wants to do this. The crew is doing that, right? Like plural nouns, collective nouns do not generally specify the gender of the members of the group that they're used to point to in Hebrew. This Hebrew term is, in effect, gender inclusive. Now, when ha'am is rendered as the people, which is how it's universally translated here in this verse, would you say that women are in view? Well, that's usually how we construe the word people in everyday English, both women and men. Women are people too. Duh. But let's take a closer look at the scene. If we look back to the beginning of this story, a few verses earlier, we read verses 7 and 8. Vayavo Moshe vayikra l'ziknei ha'am. Then in the next verse, Vaya'anu chol ha'am yachdav. God has been speaking to Moses, given Moses a message about how to prepare for this event that is to come, this revelation. And then it says Moses went back and summoned the elders of the people. So he's going to relay God's message to them. He does so in the ellipsis that I didn't fit on the page here. And as soon as he's finished delivering his message to the elders, Vaya'anu chol ha'am yachdav, the people all responded together. And they said, sure, let's go for it. Now, who is this Am who's actually speaking here? Reasoning by inference, it has to be the elders of the people. They're the only ones actually on the scene. The text is regarding them as if they are standing in for the nation as a whole. And that's why they can be referred to as Ha'am, the people. The text here depicts the elders in much the same way that the Constitution of the United States of America depicted the delegates who signed it. They wrote, "We the people of the United States of America." And then they signed it as delegates who were representing the people. As long as we view those representatives as legitimate representatives, then it's fair to speak of them as the people, we the people, and let them speak for the people. In fact, we would prefer to let them talk in those terms and speak of them in those terms, in order to emphasize that they're acting not only on their own behalf, but also on behalf of others. Well, the Bible also, over and over again, depicts a party of delegates or envoys as making an agreement on behalf of others, in particular on behalf of the Bnei Israel, the children of Israel, the Israelites. It appears that representation is the frame of reference that the ancient Israelites themselves used when they conceived of the making of contracts or covenants. Generally, they would have a set of duly authorized representatives doing the job. So technically, it's actually the elders who stood at Mount Sinai to receive God's revelation, but the way that this is expressed in the text is to refer to them as the people. Translators who rendered the Hebrew term Am here as the people standing at the foot of the mountain don't necessarily mean to claim that all the men and the women were standing at the foot of Mount Sinai. But that's what you'd conclude if you used the frame of reference that we first brought to this when we started. I was actually criticized once in a review by a prominent scholar for translating in this way, Moses led the people. As if I were implying that I foolishly believed that all the women were standing at the mountain. I'm pretty sure that scholar barely read my work, but that's another story. We still haven't answered the initial question, though. Were women present in this momentous scene? What does representation by the elders mean in terms of gender? Well, I don't think we can say for sure, one way or the other, given that the Bible never anywhere defines who counted as an elder or what it took to become one. I don't think we have sufficient grounds to exclude women altogether from the ranks of what an ancient Israelite audience would have understood by the term elders. At any rate, here in this story, it simply isn't the text's concern to specify the gender of those who stood at Sinai. So the text's focus is on the fact that the elders, whoever they may have been, Hebrew hazikenim, that they were representing everyone regardless. So as much as I might want to discern whether women stood at Mount Sinai according to the plain sense of the text, this is one case where I just have to say, I don't know. Let's sum up where we've been. I know you see a little note at the bottom that says there's more slides. I wasn't planning on using them all. Depends on what questions you might ask later. So I'm ready to sum up. Point number one, we must make inferences from the context and not just focus on individual words as if their meaning is fixed in stone and just what the dictionary might happen to tell us if we look in the dictionary. Two, translations make trade-offs. Depending on for what purpose we might want to use one translation might be better for some things and not so good for others. Three, use the same frame of reference as the ancient Israelites used. You can use other frames of reference for other purposes, but if I'm interested in the plain sense of the text, this is really what I'm saying is that the frame of reference that you bring to the text matters. It affects what you get, how the text reads to you, how you interpret it. And to these, let me add two bonus words of advice. One is, don't be too certain that you know what the translators meant. Like my published critic who said, well, look, he rendered as the people, that means he thought that all of the men and the women were standing at Sinai. No, I was actually getting at something else, using a different frame of reference. And don't expect a translation to answer all your questions. It's too concise for that, too compact, too succinct, too laconic. Let it prompt more questions. And that's even what I like to say about the Hebrew Bible, is that it's a vehicle for generating really good questions. So let's see what good questions or comments you might have.
In your opinion, how much does gender matter in biblical Hebrew? How much does the text emphasize it?
How much does gender matter in biblical Hebrew? How much does the text emphasize it? Generally, I think it's like the situation of sports writers. We're talking about the NFL or the NBA or the Dodgers. It can go without saying that the social roles are a given, that men do certain things, women do other things. There is some overlap. There is certainly an authority that women have over some men in certain situations and that kind of thing. But you don't have to talk about it all the time because everybody already knows. So when it's a given, the Bible often talks in gender-neutral terms or doesn't go out of its way to emphasize gender by and large. That's why it takes so much work to kind of reconstruct what's going on in their in the text. I had to go through all these exercises because they weren't very explicit. And it's kind of like that too, I think, when we talk to each other in normal speech as well. Just a lot of it goes without saying about what's appropriate for someone of a particular gender to be wearing and how to be speaking and how to behave in a job interview and all kinds of other things that we just take for granted that that's how gender works. And if you want to read a little more and you have nothing else to read, you can look on some articles on my website. Is there more?